At Let's Tell Their Story, we'd like to advise that some content may contain rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, child abduction, and murder. Not all content is suitable for all audiences. Please be advised while listening. Thank you.
Hi, welcome back to Let's Tell Their Story. My name is Casey, and I apologize for the quality of the first video that came out. I'm not sure what happened there. I will be redoing that case down the road. Just, my Trace deserves better than what she got. So, let's get into today's case, and today's case it's an old-timey case, and those that have been listening for some time know that I love a good old-timey case. And not just that, and this I don't love, but it does happen, is for some reason I come across the horrors of decapitation in a lot of my so-called episodes, and I don't know why it is. They just seem to find me. And this one is no different. So I'm going to give you guys a heads up that this episode does involve the slaughtering of animals, decapitation, abortion, hanging, lynching, and there's some graphic details about the murder victim. So if you continue listening or watching, I completely understand. It is at your own discretion. But first, let's get this week's missing person out of the way. Or not out of the way. Let's get the missing person known first. This week is Kirkland C. Young. He was last seen by family or friends on December 4th, 2012. Kirkland was last seen leaving home to possibly go to the VA, and he's not been seen since. Kirkland is from Gary, Indiana. He is, as of today, 57 years old, and African American with brown eyes, who stands 6'2" to 6'6", and weighs anywhere between 250 and 280 pounds. The Kirkland was last seen, his head had been shaved. So if you have any information on the whereabouts of Kirkland C. Young, please contact the Gary Police Department at 219-881-1214 and ask for Lieutenant Lawrence Wright. And the case number for Kirkland is 12G as in Gary 083176. Now on to today's case. We've all heard that the 80s were a wild time and to be alive, and oh, were they. However, I was just a youngster at the time, and my parents kept me for the most part pretty secluded from the evils that lingered in the 1980s. However, us true crime fanatics have heard of the satanic panic of the 80s, and no, I'm not going into depth on the corrupted daycare. If you know, you know. And like I said previously, this is an old-timey case, and I'm going to take you on a time travel all the way back to the late 1800s. So let's begin with a building built in 1850 in northwestern Kentucky and nearby Cincinnati, Ohio, a slaughterhouse and meatpacking facility to be exact, where in the deepest, lowest part of the building, a well was dug to hold blood, guts, and waste of the slaughtered animals. In the 1890s, this particular building was known to have secret meetings of ritualistic satanic cult activity held around the well. In the early part of the 1890s, the slaughterhouse and meatpacking facility was demolished, And the lot sat empty until the 1920s. And a new building was built during the Prohibition, and this new building served as a casino, nightclub, and speakeasy. Today, we know this building by a more notorious name, the Bobby Mackey Music World in Wilder, Kentucky. 22 years after the original building was built, Alexander Stanford Bryan and Susan Jane Farrow Bryan welcomed their 12th and final child into the world on October 25th, 1872 in Greencastle, Indiana. A baby girl they named Pearl. Pearl not only was the baby of the family, but also, according to her older siblings, she was considered her parents' favorite child. Probably more like she was just the baby and treated as the baby, so her siblings thought she was a favorite child. Not much otherwise is known about the childhood of Pearl, other than the fact that her father, Alexander, was a wealthy farmer in Greencastle. Pearl's story really gets more told, and unfortunately has a horrendous ending when she was 22 years old. Even though Pearl came from a wealthy family, she had a wholesomeness about her, with big, bright blue eyes, blonde hair that shaded to auburn, and a flawless complexion. She had a cheerful and bubbly nature about her that made her a social favorite of the Bryan family. In the summer of 1893, Pearl's cousin William Wood introduced her to a friend of his, Scott Jackson, while Scott happened to be visiting his mother in Greencastle. For Pearl, the Sunday school teacher and church worker, it seemed to be love at first sight. She wasn't just smitten on Scott Jackson, she was enamored with him. The two were just friends up until the summer of 1895. When their relationship became more romantic and a lot more scandalous. Now, a little backstory on Scott Jackson. He was the son of a transatlantic sea captain, so he traveled a lot when he was a teenager, or by the time he was a teenager. And that was when his father passed, and he and his mother moved to Jersey City, New Jersey, where he began working with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company until his boss was charged with embezzling several thousands of dollars. And even though Scott Jackson was never charged with anything, he did lose his job with the railroad company. When he met Pearl, he was at school at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery, going to school to become a dentist. And this is where he would meet Alonzo Walling. Now, Alonzo, I'll get more into detail with him in a little bit because he does play a pretty significant role in this story. After Scott headed back to school, Pearl discovered she was with child and confided in her cousin Will that she was pregnant sometime in January of 1896. So this would make her about 5 months pregnant. Will then wrote to Scott that Miss Bryan made a discovery, and Scott wrote back to Will and told him to tell the girl to come to Cincinnati. Pearl took no time in heading to Cincinnati. However, she told her parents that she was going to Indianapolis to see friends. Pearl must have been excited. She was heading to Cincinnati, and that she felt that the man of her dreams was going to do the right thing and marry her, and they'd be a nice little family. On Tuesday night, January 28th, 1896, Pearl arrived by train to the Cincinnati Grand Central Station with her suitcase in hand. Little did Pearl know that Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling had different plans for her. When Pearl arrived at the train station that night, there was a heated argument between Pearl, Scott, and Alonzo that Pearl was to have an abortion, and Pearl did not agree with this. She angrily shouted that she was going to take the noon train back to Greencastle and tell her brother that what Scott had done and that her brother would the wrongs would be righted. However, Pearl would never make that noon train because the day that she was to make the noon train, the three were later spotted visiting in the sitting room of Legner's Tavern. But once again, the visiting turned to a heated argument, and one of the staff saw Scott put something in Pearl's sarsaparilla. It would later be determined that the substance that he put in her sarsaparilla was cocaine. Somewhere along Scott's schooling in dentistry, he had learned that cocaine could induce a miscarriage since he wasn't planning on marrying Pearl, and he never had. On February 1st, 1896, John Luck's farmhand, John Hewig, was headed to work, and cutting through the fields, he seen what seemed to be a woman laying in the field. He wasn't sure if she was drunk or if she was dead, so he let Colonel John Luck know what was going on, and they got a hold of authorities right away. The authorities got there, and it didn't take them long to realize that the drunken woman was not drunk. She was indeed passed away and dead, since they had pulled down, the skirt was up over the head, and the authorities pulled her skirt down and noticed that this woman did not have a head. Now, there was no news coverage or anything like that at the time, but it did not take long for the town folk to come running and seeing what all the commotion was at the Luck farm. It would take roughly 4 days for this woman's body to be identified as Pearl Bryan. And her identification ended up being figured out through her shoes, since her clothing seemed disheveled. She was into a scuffle with someone before she was killed. But her shoes, they were pristine, and since this was the 1800s and they would make a mockery of things, there were people from the townsfolk that took bloody leaves and pieces of the crime scene. The crime scene was right away tampered. Didn't take long. So, even to the point that the shoes were a big deal with this case, since they were so pristine, that the shoe store owner came to actually look at these particular shoes, and they had only sold a certain number of shoes. So after they narrowed down the shoe owners, it was determined that these particular shoes are owned by Pearl Bryan. When Pearl's parents, Alexander and Susan, were informed of Pearl's death, they wouldn't believe it, because it couldn't have been Pearl. She was visiting friends in Indianapolis. It didn't take them long to figure out, when Alexander and Susan got a hold of the friends in Indianapolis, those friends said that Pearl had never planned on visiting. It didn't take long for the authorities to figure out who had done the murder, since Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling had both been seen with Pearl a few nights earlier, and since the staff member at the tavern had also seen the substance being poured in Pearl's drink, it wasn't going to take long for Scott and Alonzo to both be arrested. And headlines read, 2 young dental students and a minister's son arrested on murder. Now, who is the minister's son? That would be Alonzo Walling. He was the Methodist minister's son. So a lot of us that grew up in areas, we all know it's either the cops' kids or the minister's kids that are always the troublemakers. I'm not trying to throw out a stereotype or anything like that, but from my own experience, that stereotype kind of rings true. Now, when Scott and Alonzo were arrested, neither one of them would give a confession on what happened to Pearl that night. There was a trial, and during the trial, it came out that the suitcase that Pearl brought with her was handed to the bartender of the tavern to hold overnight. Scott had given it to him and said, basically, I need you to hold this. I'll come and get it. And the bartender made a joke. What's in there? A bowling ball? Because it was rolling around like a bowling ball. And it's... So, and then a couple days later, Scott came back, got it, and then picked it up from the bartender, and when he returned it again, it was empty. The judge pretty much cracked the whip and said if they didn't give a full confession, that they'd both be hanged. And that's exactly what would end up happening. They could have saved themselves from being hanged if either one of them would have admitted to the crime of what happened and told authorities exactly where Pearl's head ended up. So they refused. They told them... Alonzo and Scott both told the authorities that her head was in the Ohio River. Well, when they sent researchers for it, they didn't find it. They said it was buried somewhere else and whatnot. There are theories onto what happened to Pearl's head, and I'll get to those in just a moment. So while Jackson and Walling were in jail, there was actually a jailbreak, and Alonzo and Scott feared so much because there was talk of Pearl's family and friends that were going to lynch these guys, that when the jailbreak happened, they stayed in their cells just because they were so afraid of being lynched, even though they were going to be hanged. Now, the theories on what happened to Pearl's head is that it was used as a satanic ritual in the lower part by the well in what is now known as the Bobby Mackey's Music World building. There's also the theory that they may have given it to the professors at the schooling that they were at the dentistry school, and they gave the head as like a cadaver head and an anonymous one. And what they seem to do afterwards is in the dentist school, they had a furnace that would cremate the cadavers once they were done using them. So that is probably the biggest possibility on what happened to Pearl's head. On March 20th, 1897, Alonzo Walling and Scott Jackson were taken to the gallows to be hanged. And this was a spectacle. Everyone came to see this, as this was something people did back in the 1800s. Well, they were on the way to the gallows. Scott Jackson made a comment about Alonzo being innocent. However, once they got to the gallows, he was asked again if there was anything he had to say. And he said, no, I don't. And then Alonzo was asked the exact same question if he had anything to say. And his answer was a little different than Scott's. He basically said, you're hanging an innocent man. It's also believed that when the gallows opened and the two had the ropes hanged around their heads, that when the floor dropped to hang them, that the ropes didn't drop like they should have, and the two ended up suffocating or being strangled to death, which honestly, what they did to Pearl, they had that coming. And with people say that they still see, when they go to the Bobby Mackey's music world, they claim to see a headless woman in a blue dress, which they believe is probably Pearl. And Pearl just happens to be just one of the many hauntings that haunt the Bobby Mackey music world due to its ritualistic, satanic history. It's got some mobster connection, and that before Alonzo was hanged, he did say that he would come back and haunt the place from the beyond. And just to this day, on Pearl's gravestone, people still leave pennies heads up because they want to, when the day of resurrection comes, they don't want her to be headless. And like I said, there have been many other things that have happened at the Bobby Mackey Museum music world that have unexplained phenomenon behind them. And Pearl Bryan is just one story of many. And until next time, stay safe, but stay curious. And subscribe. Love you. Bye.